So these paintings here are the Primal Series paintings. These are story paintings that address sexual taboos and uncomfortable subject matter. There are many other precedents in many cultures where animals are combined with human forms. And the primal paintings also bring into consideration the nature of reality and individuality. Humans often anthropomorphize animals, so we have creatures like Peter Rabbit. And my art goes in the opposite direction, looking for the animal in the human psyche. So I'm interested in how religion has influenced our culture and our way of interacting with the environment. So these paintings are very graphic representations of bizarre situations. And they tell stories that go beyond the initial visual transgression, but also hinge on the forbidden subject matter. There are moments that are poised in to continue in time, and for this reason they are suggestive rather than demonstrative. So I avoid overt suggestion. It's more the presentation of something that's hanging in the balance at whatever point. So the one on the top left is called necromance. And necromancy was the practice of laying hands on the dead in order to communicate with the spirit world. And apparently it was a common practice for priests in some pagan cultures like the Maca of South America to have sex with a sacrificial victim after death in an effort to communicate with that spirit world. So necromancy has a long tradition in Greek and Roman cultures, and many rituals were developed to facilitate the exchange. In this painting, I'm also referencing the Tibetan burial tradition, where bodies are dismembered and fed to vultures as a way of reconnecting with the spiritual realm. So the woman is painted as if she's levitating, and her head is taken from, there's a stately African antelope called a kudu. So the males have these amazing horns that go way up. Anyway, so it's the protagonists are actually, they have their hands upon that body, but it's not, although there's a possible lascivious quality, the main thing is a communicative thing. It's like, maybe you could say it's even communicating beyond death, and just seeing it like that. This the next painting to discuss is the one on the right. It's called Rethink. This painting uses Auguste Rodin's famous statue, The Thinker, but liberated from a pedestal, and it floats in a sort of bizarre way to establish like an uncomfortable space. You can't quite sort of get it. So the female in this is this is actually like a bonobo animal or primate, and what's very noticeable about them is that they have external genitals, and it's a matriarchal society, and every transaction is accompanied by some kind of sexual activity. So if there's a dominant submission or anything like that, or sharing of food or whatever, there's this immediate bonding, and then they get on and they sort of share the food. So what I'm suggesting here is like if we were looking at a human genital, we would be saying, well, this is pornographic. But in this case, I've combined the two. So what it's suggesting is it's a challenge to people to imagine something like that, and then also to think of it as like the sheer creation of an organ which is external and prehensile is a huge evolutionary achievement. So in many ways, like our sense of evolution is that the humans have in some way risen to the top of something, whereas what this is pointing out is that at a very base level, there are other really interesting things that happen in the animal world as part of their sort of need. So in a way, this painting is called Rethink because it's almost like the chimpanzee is examining us as we would have examined him. And the Hamadryas baboon is like, to me, his head is like Einstein's head, so that's why I used him. The other interesting thing for me in that painting is the eyes. So, like I've painted it so that they kind of engage with the observer. It's like a way of sort of zeroing in. So you can almost see that the soul or the sentience in those creatures through the eyes. Okay, the painting on the left bottom. There was a book called Super Freakonomics, which was like a sort of a wild economic theory that you could get rid of cows and substitute kangaroos, farm kangaroos, because cows have got 7 stomachs, so they emit a lot of methane, and this way you'd help climate change and things. So it's kind of like a bizarre idea, but I took it as sort of thematic for this thing, because in Australia they've got these really large snakes that can, in fact, they unhinge their jaws and they can swallow a kangaroo. I think that they probably can't move for several months afterwards, but they actually can do that. So for me, it became a metaphor for capitalism. It's like the sort of almighty constricting dollar, and that the erection of the snake man, it refers to that will for power. So in a bleak landscape where the land devours us as much as we devour it. So that's basically what that one's about. This one over here is called Promiguous. It's a tragic comic painting. What I realized was happening is the Australian scientists were growing sort of human breasts on pigs for humans who've had mastectomies. So they'd would farm them and basically you'd be able to get a fairly good replacement breast. So I've used one of Titian's paintings, the Diana, as she's not a perfect Diana, but just to get the angle of the head and everything, because it was almost like an odalisque of Western womanly perfection. So it's like emblematic to me. And then I've got, actual images of sort of people with the mastectomy scars and things. So it's like a tragic painting, but at the same time it's a funny painting. And so that's basically what that one is about. Time and timelessness. I've always been interested in combining time and timelessness in my work, especially these multi-paneled works. And the issue is how to convey a story or a polemic in a beautiful way, so that there's an overall unity within this aesthetic stasis. So I try to tell a story in these things, and there are. You can imagine if you a painting this big, if you did it with ultra realism, you'd destroy it. You wouldn't have any movement, any life. So I've got caesures of activity, and then it releases, and then it might be done like you might have the suggestion of a surgeon or something like that, rather than like a sort of detailed thing. So I basically articulate it, and there's like a sense of a story with different ins and outs, almost like you were looking into like a bodily cavity. But having created that story, it's also necessary to bring it back into one image so that you could be standing there and it is one beautiful image, which it's because it's balanced, and there are things like for instance the baboon that shouts. He would, if his mouth opened and he shouted, he's actually shouting that. So it's like there's that visceral quality in the thing that like sort of makes it articulate itself. So this is a social conscience painting. They strive to articulate a message about the abuse or use of the environment, animals and humans. So I believe animals have sentience and that our environment exists by virtue of symbiotic relationships. So I see these works as engaging with important social issues of our time outside the normal aesthetic discourse. And I believe that beauty is a very important part of that attempt to communicate. So xenotransplant references failed experiments to farm interspecies organs during the 80s. There were several governments got involved, like the British government got really heavily involved, and they had a place in Huntingdon, I think, where they had all these hidden activities going on, and it was quite a disastrous thing. So they were dreaming of organ farms, and what was genetically modified pig organs were grafted onto baboons, and the baboons were supposed to host the organs until they could be transplanted into humans. So they could do it with baboons because at that time they were classified as vermin, so they were not protected. But after a while they started getting their own breeding programs anyway, so that, like, they were just breeding baboons for this. And anyway, stem cell research has replaced this kind of experimentation now anyway, so that's good. Loosening identity. After completing this painting, I began to question my representational technique and way of communicating the narrative. So my recent work has revolved around the idea of loosening identity. And Felix Guattari's concept, I've sort of stolen it. It's called chaosmosis. And I really like that idea. It's like something coming from chaos and moving through membranes or something into some other state. So I like that to describe these particular works, in particular these last two. So these terms like abstraction and figuration aren't that meaningful for me. I prefer to think of marks as being bound to the subject or having their boundaries released to allow osmosis to take place. So this series I've called the Intuit series, sort of because it's an intuitive series of works. And they explore a loosening of identity to evoke metaphor and mystery. So I begin with drawing lines and forms on paper. Nothing is identifiable at that stage, and I translate the drawings into paintings and use a process of staining to introduce flowing elements. Then I try to be intuitive and feel the communication that sort of seeks to emerge. So the titles are sometimes verbs implying action as a process of becoming. I've been influenced by David Bohm's concept of implicate order, where everything is interconnected and enfolded within, which reminds me of the poet William Blake's concept of finding the world in a grain of sand. So cybernate is the one on the end there, and cybernate references the cybernetics of Gregory Bateson, which address the structural patterns underlying all living systems. So what pattern connects? Cybernetics studies the relationship between the human and animal nervous systems and mechanical systems. So in his book, he explores the idea that organisms are connected through patterns like bilateral symmetry and serial homology. So it's like a crayfish or something. You've got the head of a crayfish, and then the parts of it moving back. So he would compare different creatures at different levels to humans, and so like we'd have 5 fingers and like lengths of just the general structure of form. So the anatomy of exhibits a growth sequence, so that, for instance, the anatomy of a crab is repetitive and rhythmical. Like music, it is repetitive with modulation. And the direction from head to tail corresponds to a sequence in time. In embryology, the head is older than the tail, and a flow of information is possible from front to rear. So he's seeking a meta pattern. So I think I identify with that because art is also bound up with concepts like symmetry and serial homology, so that in a way our sort of blank spaces and our ways of structuring and putting things into proportion, it sort of reflects that kind of like a serial homology or concepts of symmetry. So it's imitating life. So we've got passages of interconnecting samenesses or serial homologies, and the eye is guided through the experience as if in a growth sequence. So the use of symmetry and asymmetry also affect our sense of dynamism and balance. The painting over there is the third one along is called Reiterate, and that's the polar bear and the walrus. And in that painting, I was trying to reach a mythical reality. It's almost like something like finding Moby Dick or something at some kind of level. It's like a meaningful moment, but it's something that possibly they encountered like daily in their lives. So for me, that painting was about trying to explore an abstract way of expressing what the figurative elements ended up expressing. So that's why it's called Reiterate. It's saying the same thing again in a different way. So that chaos osmosis that I mentioned is possibly most noticeable in this work here, and to some extent this is called Impregnate. And what I was trying to do was try and take sort of an ejaculation, impregnation, and pregnancy, and almost like layer everything on top of each other. So and by releasing the form, I could just leave enough of the form to give that idea, but have other things, like be able to place other things on top of it, which would sort of extend the metaphor in some kind of way. So it's like what I've got here is, so it visualizes the internal organs as a personage, and superimposes various stages of that through pregnancy. So operate. This is the final one. This is. I have a friend who had polycystic kidney disease, and she needed a kidney. And at the time that this painting was getting painted, we were all trying to auction art so that she could get this operation. She's in Africa. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to imagine her from within and without. So it's like looking at her being on a table and being off a table at the same time, and like this is actually what a polycystic kidney looks like, and it can be as big as a football. So it was a way of exploring. It's called Operate. So it was a way of exploring form and combining different sort of aspects of it. So you can see aspects of maybe the operation taking place, or maybe just a memory of a doctor who might have been there actually doing it. So it tries to build up a richness into the whole piece. So these 4 paintings representing the Intuit series, they're experiments to find a language that will work for monumental social conscience paintings. So, like, I want to do some on some of the issues that bother me, like fracking and poaching and shark finning. So these are like 20-foot paintings, 8 foot by 20 foot with multi-panels. And I'm trying to work out a new way of doing it so that the paintings have like metaphor and mystery, which is like one of the things that I felt here. I released the bounds to some extent. So like I've only developed certain areas like the head of the baboon, or some area like the snake. But I wanted something that could be even more sort of overlaid and in some way mixed up. So that's where the future paintings will be going, something like this. But trying to deal with issues of our time, environmental issues. So in conclusion, I think of art as a biological manifestation of the species body-mind. I believe that if we can activate new perceptions, which already exist in the so-called unconscious or archetypal mind, we can influence cultural change. I believe that animals have sentience and humans need to increase empathy for our own survival. Individualism is reductive, while a quantum mechanical reality would be fluid. Thus, space is not empty. The self contains others, and time is embedded in the present. The boundaries of individuality need to be loosened to include the environment. We need to see a tree or endangered species as an inherent part of our communal identity. So that was my final word on the matter. Thank you. I don't know if people have any questions or aspects of. Yeah.
I find that when looking at the work, it's highly emotional. You have a field of red here. You have chaotic movement in the work over there. And yet when you speak, you're talking in a historical, analytical, and intellectual way, but your paintings are emotional. So I'm trying to fuse the two, the intellectual and the emotional. And it seems that what maybe I want to ask you is the fusion between the animal and the human, and is it an emotional fusion?
To me, this painting here is hugely emotional because I was so pissed off about this whole thing because it was a con. Like, they were basically getting money, governmental money to run these programs, and these baboons were lasting hours and if they were lucky, days. So it's just like a line of dead bodies coming out of this thing.
You're talking about xenotransplant.
Yeah, xenotransplant. Mm-hmm. And the thing was that a lot of the scientists at the time had been saying, look, you can't do this because there are all these, they call them pervs, they're like viruses that are in pigs that would then leap across the species barrier, and then you'd basically be infecting your population. So for me, this painting I had to get out of my psyche. So I was really, really angry about that kind of thing.
What fascinates me is that you have a visceral response, but your work has a social function.
Yeah.
You trigger your audience into reflection, and what is this about? That was my reaction after I saw your works initially.
Yeah.
What is he saying? And your works are immensely complex, and they have very many multiple layers.
It's good because, you know, it's like I think works must actually, to be interesting to me, to paint them, they need to have something to say. Anyway, so
when you were making these paintings, these ones here and this one series, I saw the production of it, and it just made me sick. And then it was so strong. The feeling of it was so powerful. I understand what Isaac means, because you are talking historically about the history of our consciousness and our lack of sentiments with the animals that we use. And you are picking up the sentiments of the animal, and you are representing the animal in this. And that, I think, is why it is so strong, because that is your feeling of the pain of the animal.
I think you're also forcing us to look at the animal in ourselves, that we're not separate from these guys.
Yeah, totally not
When I
separate.
look into some of these faces, I see in some ways human faces looking back at me. That maybe the human/animal face I don't want to see, that our culture doesn't want to see in ourselves. And it's exactly that divorce from the animal that has led to our ability to so callously lay waste to the earth. But I don't see a separation. I mean, here we see human hands coming in from the side, but then I look into Uyn's face and I see a tortured human being as well as a tortured animal. I can't separate them. And I think that is one of the deepest powers of your work, that you're refusing to let us make that separation between the human and the animal in the way you paint.
And when you said, I'm telling a story, this is a story, immediately my hackles went up, because of course, you know, there are only a handful of very threadbare stories that are allowed to be made into films over and over again. We get the same story. And yet I see these stories that we're so familiar with, they're here in these paintings. And yet you've kind of moved the dialogue along a little bit. And earlier in your first section, you talked about the aggression of the narrative. And I just would like you to kind of amplify that point a little more.
There is an aggression in a lot of this work. Very, very, very much so. Like even in the colors, and it's in a way like being transgressive like this. You go against cultural norms. When you do something like that, you know that society is not necessarily going to approve of that. In fact, I've had people sort of look at the stuff and turn and walk away. They couldn't actually look at it. But I think it's important to present challenges, visual challenge, and I think we have to understand that we could be looking quite comfortably at an animal's genitals. Why are we so sensitive about our own? Why does it suddenly become pornographic? It's kind of like if we were part of that animal world, we would have to reassess and maybe become sort of less pathological and you know, maybe be able to live with each other at a you know. So Real, you were gonna say?
Well, sort of. I'm not sure it makes sense, but if you have a goal in your new paintings to address social, environmental issues through metaphor and mystery, so that's a conscious goal. How does that relate to the actual theme in that timeless moment you spoke of, that period of ambiguity and contradiction within yourself, the process?
Well, all of these paintings, as Peter was sort of pointing out, they all come out of a visceral response to the actual stuff that you create with. And things get thought about afterwards and put into sort of a more conscious reflection. So everything that I do will still have the guts or the mess or whatever it is that is actually I'm responding to at the time. So I think if one doesn't overthink things, especially in the initial stages, you need to interact with it.
But, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Just to go back to what you said about that sort of transition and process from visceral to using
The conscious
conscious
stuff.
process. That second phase, what do you think you're doing more of? Are you refining the first phase, or to what extent are you changing that first phase into something else?
I think
And so what are you
yeah. I think at some level you're dragging an image out of yourself, and I think it is coming from a subconscious place. But I think of the consciousness as somewhat of an extension of that unconscious. So I don't see them as a separate thing, and I think that it flows through that. So my conscious is almost like an insect's things putting out and feeling the world to try and figure out where it is and what information is out there.
So you don't find there's I know in my own work, one of the things I'm conscious of is sometimes sort of overcooking the image.
Yeah, it's a terrible thing to do that, yeah.
And I find that sometimes comes from that second
Mm.
phase.
Mm.
So but you don't find that there's a tension between the two phases?
I suppose there is automatically, like you can run something by overthinking it. That's for sure.
Or by trying to, like for example, one of the issues is you can have something that's kind of a visceral mass, that first phase. But you also kind of have an obligation is the right word, but you're trying to communicate that to an audience too.
Yeah.
So
it's really touchy in that, because what you don't want to happen is for the creation to end up being a polemic that is pretty much part of the existing culture. So in other words, you're just repeating the stuff in another form. Like, I feel like you, as an artist, you have to reinvent it. So that image has to in some way be able to stand on its own. As in my case, I'm interested in beauty too. So like, it might be a terrible beauty, but like, I'm interested in that. So it must have something that holds it.
Or I think sometimes the tension is you can sometimes castrate the energy in the first phase by trying, for example, to make it a clearer path of communication.
Yeah. I think it's a really touchy area, because I think you can totally ruin a painting, and by just overdoing it.
But there's a great sense of irony with the medical symbol, where the medical field says we will do no harm,
Yeah.
and then it dissolves.
In the name of
and they
medical
call
science,
this,
yeah.
you call it as,
Yeah.
how is it anything but harm? It's a great sense of irony, and then it looks like it dissolves into a staff, a broken staff at the bottom, where the same colors.
That's the pharmaceutical symbol.
Yes.
And this here is interesting. There are two, where it's got two snakes. That was the military
Yes.
thing. And if you go back to the Grecian origins of that sign, it actually meant commercial exploitation. So that's why I used it there, because the medical one has got the single staff with. So
It's also a different story if you read it right to left.
Yeah.
Catherine read it left to right.
Yeah.
And I instinctively read it right to left. Which is interesting. I mean, the narrative,
Yeah.
with whatever springs from
yeah,
it.
yeah.
That's what painting does.
Yeah, exactly. I also thought that when you were describing your process of creation, that you were actually moving from the animal to the human. The process was combining the two. And to me, that's the power of art, is that it doesn't ever ask us to leave basically who we are, but allows us to rise into something.
To think of, to be able to extend ourselves beyond ourselves. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Thanks.